And ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Reverend Russell Heiland to Unity Center of Davis, my friend and just a wonderful minister. Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, Reverend Richard. It is an honor to have been invited. I so appreciate Reverend Richard as a friend and as a colleague. So the fact that he invited me to share with you really speaks to my heart, and I'm so grateful to be here. Just a word, we should be able to wrap up by about 2:15, so just stay with me and it'll be good. So actually, no. So here's a question for you we don't often ask in church, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there anyone joining us today who is a fan of rodeos? Any rodeo fans? Okay, we got a couple. Great, thanks. So you may know this already, but the word rodeo is borrowed from the Spanish and literally means to round up, like to corral. But if you change the accent a little bit and make it rodeo, it means to round up prices to their maximum extent, giving us the name of Rodeo Drive there in Beverly Hills. So a little bit of trivia. So that might be important if you're playing Trivial Pursuit someday. So let's think about rodeos. So rodeos have cowboys and cowgirls and bucking broncos and bulls and clowns and broken bones, of course. And it gives us the expression, this ain't my first rodeo, meaning one is experienced with a certain situation, especially one that might be dangerous or have a few pitfalls or deceitful practices by others. But here's something you may not know. This idiom is generally traced back to the 1981 movie Mommy Dearest, in which the character of Joan Crawford actually says it. Now, about this movie, it received horrible reviews, and at the second Golden Raspberry Awards, won the Razzie for Worst Picture that year. And again, another useless fact, but it might be helpful in a Trivial Pursuit game sometime. Well, a decade later, country singer Vern Gosdin wrote a song entitled "This Ain't My First Rodeo," having heard the idiom from a local carpenter. So do we have any country music fans with us today? Okay, now some of you may be familiar with that song. So it is reasonable to assume that the carpenter did not learn this idiom from the movie Mommy Dearest, as the film was actually not seen by many people in theaters. We can surmise then that this expression, "this ain't my first rodeo," seems to have been a colloquialism circling around prior to its breakthrough in mass media. So let's get back to rodeos. So think about a cowboy or a cowgirl riding a bucking bronco. It's rough, it's unpredictable, people are yelling, clowns are all around, and no doubt many people in the stands are thinking, you gotta be nuts to actually do this, which is kind of why we go to see rodeos, to see people do nutty things. And it kind of reminds me of the last few years we have all been experiencing. I mean, is it just me, or has anybody else felt like the last few years we've been holding on with one arm for dear life, trying not to fall off a bucking bronco, being chased by a scary Joan Crawford? Is that anyone else? Okay, great, thanks. All right, just want to make sure I'm not the only one. I don't want to project shamelessly onto everybody else if it's only my own experience. So in dealing with situations like this, we often go to scripture, right? And there is a particular saying from the Gospel of Thomas that I think really addresses this sort of scary rodeo clown situation that many of us have been living with. So if you're not familiar with the Gospel of Thomas, let me give you just the briefest little background about it. So in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in December 1945, some Egyptian farmers went out looking for fertilizer, and what they found was scripture. Now, I don't know if there's a connection between the two, but it seemed kind of ironic in my mind. They did, however, find an ancient earthenware jar containing 13 leather-bound papyrus books containing over 50 written works, including the text of what is known as the Gospel of Thomas in the Coptic language. Now, although scholars knew about the Gospel of Thomas, since it was mentioned by early Christian writers, there was no known copy until then. So the Gospel of Thomas is comprised of 114 sayings, or logions in Greek, or short parables, and is referred to as a sayings gospel. There are no narrative stories, no nativity of Jesus, no Passion Week, just sayings or short parables. And it's believed by many scholars to be contemporaneous with, or even earlier than, some of the canonical or the official gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And many of the sayings found in Thomas are also found in the canonical gospels, but there are a few that are not. So one theory is that for the early Jesus moment, it was easier to remember short sayings of Jesus rather than huge stories, kind of like how we use sound bites today. Over time, though, the early Jesus movement grew. The sayings were fleshed out with longer narratives, the ones we know today. What's interesting to me is that owing to the relatively recent discovery of Thomas, there are no unity or new thought interpretations of it, no series of books by Elizabeth Sand Turner or Charles Fillmore. So it is ripe for unity truth students like you and me to do our own metaphysical interpretation. So here's one of the sayings, one of the logians that really speaks to me about the whole notion of rodeo sort of experiences. It's in the Gospel of Thomas, logian number 2. So it's right at the beginning. So Gospel of Thomas, logian or saying number 2. And it goes like this. Jesus said, "Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will reign over all." So let me repeat that. Those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel and will reign over all. You might be thinking, this sounds a little familiar, because in the Gospel of Luke, there's a teaching on prayer. And this is Luke 11, verses 9 and 10. And it goes like this. And this is Jesus speaking again. "So I say to you, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And for the one who knocks, the door will open." And in prayer and conversation and social media discourse, we've been doing a lot of asking and seeking for peace among nations, healing from the pandemic, freedom from wanton violence, transformation of social division to unity, finding peace and equanimity. You know, all the regular things, you get the picture. And both of these two scriptures provide comfort by affirming that whatever is sought will indeed be found. But Thomas adds a step that Luke does not, what I call the mommy dearest rodeo step, when he says, when they find, they will be disturbed. Other translations say dismayed or even troubled. Well, that sure is cheery. Thanks, Thomas. I'm glad I picked you up. So why is that? Let me give you a little side story and I'll come back to that. So years ago, when we first got into Unity, we visited a Unity church in Asheville, North Carolina. And I saw a bumper sticker in their bookstore that caught my eye. And at the time, I thought it was a little crass, and I still think it's a little crass, but it's kind of funny. And I didn't buy one though. And this is what it said: "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." And I'm like, you sell that in a bookstore? And I realized, of course I do. This is Unity. We can do things like that. So why would the truth prompt a response like that? Could it be that when we find what we're looking for, it isn't exactly what we thought it would be? Or maybe we aren't who we thought ourselves to be. We've learned something about ourselves along the way. You know, consider that adage, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Or think about the number of coming of age stories and end of innocence stories that are published in books and made into movies. Each one involves some manner of angst or sadness or conflict and overcoming. And even when we teach Bible interpretation, there are two experiences that we have to address. One is what some scholars refer to as pre-critical naivete, which, to quote another bumper sticker I saw growing up in Indiana that said, "God says it, I believe it, that settles it," to a more post-critical naivete, in which the reader is able to discern the universal capital T truths, even though the story itself may not be factual. We have lowercase facts, capital T truths. And when we discover these things, it can be disturbing or troubling. I think it's a truism that in most fields of endeavor, as well as the stuff that happens in the real world, there are a lot of things that they don't teach you in school. For example, I serve as a credentialing minister for Unity Worldwide Ministries, and I mentor new ministers. And almost all of them go through a phase of disbelief when they realize that how much of their time as the minister of a center or church is devoted to such spiritual matters as fundraising, asbestos remediation, rental contracts, plumbing, county zoning boards, to name a few. And all of them have almost to a person said, "This is not why I wanted to become a minister." I pat them on the back and say, "I know, we've all been there. It's disturbing, it's troubling." Or think about what happens in one's mind and one's heart and even one's body as we study our nation's history, both past and the current history that we're making, with eyes wide open. Parts of our nation's history are so troubling that we know that there are some folks who just don't want them to be taught at all. Most notably, when we think about the legacy of slavery and its aftermath, as well as the horrific treatment of Indigenous peoples. Tomorrow, October 10th, is Indigenous Peoples Day. So I invite you all to learn more about the Indigenous peoples in this nation. There were over 500 separate tribal nations when Europeans arrived. And many of them, thank goodness, are still with us today, contributing and making our nation the rich canopy that it is. Or think about how it is when people consciously engage in their spiritual journey. How many of us, how many of you have had to reckon with and contend with embedded theologies or perceptions that we have to acknowledge were and maybe still are unfulfilling or even hurtful? Or what about just going through that process of defining for yourself what divinity means to you and changing or even abandoning long-held beliefs? Troubling, dismaying. And what about the psychological process of coming to know oneself? An experience that is ultimately connected to one's spiritual journey. It's hard. And I think this is one reason why the 4th and 5th steps of 12-step recovery programs are so often delayed or avoided. The 4th step is that taking of the searching and fearless moral inventory. And the 5th step is actually sharing it with another person. I mean, who among us wants to acknowledge what I will euphemistically call the fullness of our humanity? When to do so could mean feeling things such as guilt or shame, or acknowledging sins of omission or commission. And then tell somebody about it. You got to be nuts. That's disturbing. That's troubling. But, and there's a but, there's a get out of jail free card here, folks, because this really is a good news talk. Recall that the saying in Thomas says that when they are disturbed, they will marvel. And just as in these coming of age stories, which are really the archetypal hero's journey, there comes a moment, there comes a discovery. Well, there can come a moment or discovery when the hero, the shero, the protagonist, and that's you and me, realizes something along the lines of, wow, I actually have inner resources that I didn't know about. I am stronger. wiser, braver than I thought I could possibly ever be. Or maybe there's that moment of realization when, my goodness, I don't have to do everything by myself. There are people and there's a power and a presence ready to help me if I will allow it. You know, that's the marvel stage, that in the depths of one's darkness, paradoxically, light is found, hope is found, inspiration is found. Yes, even peace is found. I can't help but think that singer Gloria Gaynor had a similar sort of experience when she sang the song, I Will Survive. You all remember that? Not as many disco fans, you were there. I know some of you were there. And she goes, oh, no, not I will survive. Oh, as long as I know how to love, I know I'll stay alive. I've got all my life to live. I got all my love to give, and I'll survive. Hey, hey. Which is why I don't sing disco, and why they never really let me sing. And Sue, you know, we should partner on, we could do a whole like New Thought series of spiritual inspiration from the era of disco. I think there's something there. We'll take this offline. So Thomas wraps up his logion with the words, and will reign over all. And that's R-E-I-G-N, not R-A-I-N, in case you were worried about, you know, what are we going to do with the flooding? So does he mean reign over the world as a temporal ruler? I don't think so. It seems to me he's echoing a truth, capital T truth, taught by wisdom teachers the world over, regardless of tradition. The one who awakens to the Christ spirit within, or simply to spirit within, whatever languaging works for you, will reign over their own reactions and addictions and fears and cravings, to ultimately experience peace of mind, equanimity, in spite of the facts of the day. Will wake up and discover I can be fully present, I am empowered, I am a force for good. Nothing has to overwhelm me anymore. Now, this doesn't mean that they're going to hightail it up to a mountaintop and sequester themselves away from people. Actually, it means quite the opposite. It means they will remain engaged from a point of view of compassion and empowerment. It means they'll learn to recognize when they're feeling triggered or upset, like you and I will learn that we're triggered and upset, and we'll take the steps and use the tools to restore ourselves to sanity. To pray, to meditate, to exercise, to do what it takes to become centered again. It means we will be guided by spirit to use our energy and resources in the service of creating a world of peace, abundance, and respect for all creation. It's a tall order, I know, and it's not going to happen overnight. We have these wonderful humanities, let's just recognize that. But to borrow from another phrase from 12-Step Program, ours is a program of progress, not perfection. So if you don't do so great today, that's all right. Tomorrow's a new day. Let's start over. For our God is the God of infinite second chances. And that's what we experience when we stay on the spiritual path. So I'd like to close with a final 12-step reference. Don't quit before the miracle happens. And in the context of today's message, with the reference to the logion from Thomas, I would say, don't quit before the marvel happens. You know, all of us as individuals deal with significant personal matters. And I'm sure there are times when we all wonder, will this ever end? And all of us deal with collective matters, wondering again, will this ever end? It will. Nothing lasts forever. That's why I love the King James Version of the Bible, because the phrase, and it came to pass, is repeated 500 times. At no place in there does it say, and it came to stay forever. So it comes to pass. and our God is the good at the foundation of it all. So hold on, cowboys and cowgirls. The peace that passes understanding is always available to us. All we have to do is close our eyes and we will see it. All right, so in conclusion, we've covered rodeos, Rodeo Drive, Joan Crawford, Mommy Dearest, the Gospel of Thomas, prayer from the Gospel of Luke, the hidden spirituality of disco, the hero's journey, and multiple references to 12-step tradition. So I guess we're done. Thank you for your time. Peace be with you, and namaste.